This is an overview of Analyzing Poetry, War is Kind. This lesson takes place in week 2 of the fourth 9 weeks. You'll notice that in week 1, the students are introduced to satire and to satire in Huck Finn. During this week, they also begin reading Mark Twain's novel, and they work through the Examining Concise Satirical Arguments lesson. Analyzing Poetry, War is Kind, is not a satire per se. However, the lesson focuses heavily on shifts in tone, and because tone is such an important aspect in understanding satire, this lesson is very important. You'll see that 3 class days have been set aside for completing this lesson, and it's fine if it takes a little bit longer. Remember, the goal is to work through every single lesson in its entirety, and there is some time built into this 9 weeks in case some of these big lessons run a little bit long. Going into the lesson, by now we're very familiar with the way every single lesson is set up, starting with the teacher notes. This lesson uses paraphrasing and the previously taught levels of questioning strategy to guide students to an understanding of how tone shift creates deeper meaning in a poem. Some assessment options. There is a questioning activity, a poetry analysis, and the option for an analytical essay at the end of this lesson. Your teacher suggestions are broken down for each activity, and we're going to walk through those activities below. Here's the text of the poem, War is Kind by Stephen Crane. And at first glance, we can see the title is a little bit attention-grabbing. And a great way to introduce this lesson to students is to provide the title only before they see the text of the poem. When you project or write out that title for them and give them a moment to write 2 or 3 sentences that predict what they think the poem will be about, you'll get a variety of answers. Some students will take it rather literally, and they'll predict that the poem is going to be about ways that war is actually a good thing or beneficial to society in some way. Other students are a little bit quicker to pick up the irony or the sarcasm in the title, and they predict that the poem is going to be an ironic look at war and focus on how it is the opposite of kind. So, just take all of those answers and allow them to have a few moments to discuss their predictions before handing out the text of the poem. Activity 2 is to read the poem literally. We began working on this skill in the very first lesson when the students read Washington Crossing the Delaware and practiced reading poetry from punctuation to punctuation. They're going to do that again here by placing a slash mark at the end of each sentence in the poem, and then in the space to the right, they're going to write a paraphrase of each sentence. So you can see that they're using skills they've already been taught over the course of the school year. Activity 3 utilizes the levels of questions activity. In a standard face-to-face training, this is a lesson that we would work through together on the first day of training. We have not had time to address that this week because we've been using the digital format. So just know that in your classroom, by the time you make it to the fourth 9 weeks, students will have already practiced with the levels of questions. This is a review of the levels of questions using the text of Julius Caesar, which the students read in the third 9 weeks. So a level 1 question is a question for which the answer can be found in the text itself. It's on the line. Students can actually put their finger on the answer in the text. Your example question here says, what are the last words Julius Caesar utters before his death? Students who are familiar with the text can go right to those words and put their finger on that line. A level 2 question is still directly related to a specific text. It's a question for which the reader must make inferences based on the text or by reading between the lines. In this example, what do Caesar's last words reveal about his feelings toward Brutus? There's no place explicitly in the text that answers that question. However, after reading through that part of the play, students should be able to answer it with relative ease. Level 3 is a little bit more difficult because the question moves outside the text to larger questions that are universal or beyond the line. It's important when you teach students how to write a level 3 question that they make sure that they remove any specific work from the question's text. The example here, under what circumstance can a betrayal be even more harmful than a mortal physical injury? Of course, that question can be answered using the text of Julius Caesar. However, the same question can be answered using a number of texts or life situations. And that's what makes it a level 3 question. So you'll have lots of opportunities throughout the school year to practice these with students. And in this activity, they're going to create a level 1 and a level 2 question for each sentence of the poem. They're going to work all the way through the poem, creating those level 1 and 2 questions. And then the culminating part of this activity is at the very end where they create a level 3 question, just one, for the poem as a whole. In activity 4, the students are going to read the poem aloud and identify the shifts to help them understand and analyze tone. A strategy that's not really detailed in your teacher notes, but that I find very effective in my classroom, is to assign 2 students to take turns reading stanzas of the poem aloud so that everyone can experience the 2 different voices that exist within the poem. It's easy for students to see this because the way the poem is written, one voice is written in regular text and the other is italicized. So the first student would read the first stanza, and then the second student would read the italicized portion, and they would go back and forth just like that throughout the poem. After reading the poem aloud, you walk through these questions to help students get a better understanding of the 2 different tones or voices that take place in the poem that reveal the complex attitudes and complex views about war. And then finally, the 5th activity is to create a soap's tone analysis of the poem. And the guidelines for that are outlined here: subject, occasion, audience, purpose, speaker, and then tone. If this is a new activity for your students, and this is the first time in the school year that you have created a soapstone analysis, modeling is very important to make sure that they're fully addressing each of the points here. However, this is something that, knowing your students and their capabilities, you might choose to allow them to do this in pairs or even individually